In the misty solitude of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, where the Atlantic Ocean crashed against the jagged shores with a relentless roar, 69-year-old Korean War veteran Leonard Len Whitaker stood watch over the Bodie Island lighthouse, its black and white spiral a sentinel against the gray horizon. It was late October 2025, and the air carried the briny tang of salt and the faint decay of seaweed, the wind tugging at Len's weathered coat, a relic of his service with the 2nd Infantry Division, where he'd manned a machine gun post in the frigid hills of Chosin Reservoir in 1950. The bronze star pinned to his lapel, faded but intact, marked the night he held his position against overwhelming odds, saving his squad from annihilation, his hands steady despite the cold that gnawed at his bones. Now, those hands trembled slightly as he polished the lighthouse's massive Fresnel lens, its prisms catching the dim light of dusk, a ritual that had become his anchor since retiring to this remote outpost 5 years ago. Len's life had unraveled after the war. His wife, Esther, died of heart failure in 2012, and his son, James, a merchant marine, had drifted away, leaving Len with a hollow trailer and a pension eroded by VA errors that misclassified his frostbite injuries as non-service related. The lighthouse, leased to him by the National Park Service as a caretaker's residence, was his refuge, its beam a beacon not just for ships but for a soul adrift in memories of snow and gunfire. The days were long and quiet, broken only by the gulls' cries and the rhythmic pulse of the waves. Len's routine was meticulous, oiling the gears, trimming the wicks, and logging weather patterns in a ledger that dated back decades, his handwriting a shaky echo of the precise reports he'd filed in Korea. The isolation suited him, a contrast to the chaos of war, though it amplified the ghosts that haunted him, Esther's laughter, James's childhood pranks, the faces of fallen comrades frozen in the snow. His arthritis flared in the dampness, his fingers stiff as he carved small wooden lighthouses from driftwood, leaving them on the shore like offerings to the sea. One evening, as a storm brewed on the horizon, casting the sky in bruised purples and grays, a figure appeared on the dunes, a young man, perhaps 25, with a backpack slung over his shoulder and a camera dangling from his neck. His name was Caleb Reed, a marine biology student from UNC Wilmington, researching coastal erosion. "Sir, mind if I take a photo?" Caleb called, his voice cutting through the wind. Len nodded, wary but intrigued, and watched as Caleb framed the lighthouse against the turbulent sky, the lens clicking like a heartbeat. Caleb returned the next day, his curiosity piqued by the old man's quiet presence. "You live here?" he asked, settling on a rock near the base. Len grunted. "Caretaker. Been here 5 years." The boy's questions were gentle, about the lighthouse, the storms, the carvings, and Len found himself answering, his voice a low rumble. He spoke of Korea, of the night he'd fired until his hands bled, of the medal he'd never worn with pride, tucked in a drawer with Esther's letters. Caleb listened, his eyes wide with a respect Len hadn't felt in decades. The storm broke that night, rain lashing the windows, thunder rolling like artillery, and Len played a tune on a cracked harmonica Esther had given him, the notes a lament lost in the gale. Caleb stayed, sheltered in the keeper's quarters, and as the storm eased, he suggested a project, documenting Len's story for his thesis, tying it to the lighthouse's history. Len hesitated, the idea of exposure a foreign sting, but Caleb's earnestness, the way he held a driftwood lighthouse like a relic, stirred something dormant. "Maybe," Len murmured, the word a crack in his armor, a whisper to Esther that the world might see him again. The next morning, the beach glittered with storm-tossed shells, and Len found Caleb sketching the lighthouse, his hands quick and sure. They talked of the sea's moods, of war's scars, and Len felt the pines whisper from his youth, a call to reconnect. The lighthouse's beams swept the horizon, its light a promise, and for the first time, Len wondered if its vigil might illuminate more than the night. The days following the storm settled into a fragile calm, the Atlantic surface a mirror of slate gray beneath a sky streaked with cirrus clouds, their edges tinged pink by the rising sun. Len moved through his routines with the same quiet dedication, climbing the spiral staircase to check the lens, its glass a constellation of prisms that scattered light across the keeper's quarters, the scent of oil mingling with the salt air that seeped through the cracks. The lighthouse's beam had faded with the dawn, but its rhythm lingered in Len's bones, a steady pulse that kept the ghosts at bay, memories of Chosen, of gunfire, of the men he couldn't save. Caleb's presence had become a new rhythm, his jeep rumbling down the sandy path each morning, his backpack stuffed with notebooks and a recorder, his camera slung around his neck like a talisman, capturing the lighthouse's shadow against the dunes, the gulls wheeling overhead, their cries a sharp counterpoint to the ocean's low moan. Caleb sat on the weathered bench outside, his notebook open, his questions a gentle tide eroding Len's walls. "Why lighthouses?" he asked one morning, holding a miniature Bodhi Island replica Len had carved, its stripes painted with faded colors scavenged from old cans. Len paused, his knife still against a piece of cedar, the scent of sap sharp in the air. "They guide," he said finally, his voice a low rumble, like the distant thunder of a retreating storm. "Always have. Even when I couldn't see my way." Caleb nodded, his recorder humming, and Len found himself speaking of Korea, of the night he manned his post until dawn, his fingers numb, his squad saved but his soul fractured by the cost. He spoke of Esther, her voice a melody that had once drowned out the echoes of war, and of James, whose absence was a wound that never healed. Caleb listened, his eyes steady, and Len felt the weight of being heard, a sensation as foreign as the warmth of the sun on his weathered face. That afternoon, as the tide crept in, its foam lacing the sand like a widow's veil, Caleb proposed a trip to the mainland, Nag's Head, a short drive away, to meet a veterans advocate he'd contacted through his university. "They can help with your benefits," Caleb said, his tone earnest, his hands gesturing to the trailer's sagging roof, the cracks in its walls. "You deserve more than this, Len." The idea prickled, a thorn in Len's pride, but the thought of stability, of a legacy for James, if he could be found, softened his resistance. They drove in Caleb's battered jeep, the road winding through marshes where egrets stood like sentinels, their white feathers stark against the reeds. At the advocacy office, a woman named Marla, with a no-nonsense braid and a warm smile, reviewed Len's file, her fingers tracing the VA's errors: frostbite misclassified, benefits slashed in 98, a commendation overlooked. "We can fix this," she said, her voice a promise, and Len felt a tremor, a hope he'd buried beneath years of salt and sorrow. Back at the lighthouse, the sunset painted the tower in amber and rose, its beam cutting through the gathering dusk, a steady pulse against the darkening sea. Len sat on the shore, Caleb beside him, the harmonica's notes weaving through the waves' rhythm, a mournful tune for Esther. The ocean listened, its whispers a mirror to the pines of Len's youth, and he felt the stirrings of a fight, not with guns, but with memory, a battle to reclaim what the years had stolen. The lighthouse stood watch, its light a vow, and Len knew this vigil was no longer his alone. The salt-laden winds swept across the dunes, carrying the faint tang of pine and the ocean's endless murmur, as November dawned with a chill that settled into the bones of the lighthouse. Len stood at the tower's base, his coat flapping like a tattered flag, his eyes tracing the horizon where the Atlantic met a sky streaked with the pale gold of early morning. The lighthouse's beam had faded with the sunrise, its vigil handed over to the light of day, but Len's own watch felt unending, a tether to the routines that kept his ghosts at bay, polishing the lens, checking the gears, carving driftwood into tiny lighthouses that he scattered along the shore like breadcrumbs for lost sailors. His hands shook as he carved, the cedar yielding to his knife, the shavings curling like the waves below, each stroke a quiet defiance against the years that had tried to erase him. Caleb's visits had become a steady rhythm, his jeep's engine a welcome rumble against the wind's howl, his presence a tether to a world Len had long avoided. The young man sat on the bench, his notebook open, his questions a gentle tide eroding Len's walls. "What was it like coming home?" Caleb asked, his voice soft against the wind's howl, his pen poised like a conductor's baton. Len paused, his knife still, the memory a sharp ache. "Cold," he said finally, his voice a gravelly whisper, the word carrying more than the weather. "Folks cheered, but they didn't see the frost in us. Esther did, she warmed me back to life." He spoke of her cooking, the way she'd hum gospel hymns while frying fish, her touch a balm to the nightmares that woke him screaming. Caleb listened, his eyes steady, and Len felt the weight of being heard, a sensation as foreign as the warmth of the sun on his weathered face. Marla, the veteran's advocate, sent updates through Caleb, her emails a lifeline cast across the miles. She'd filed an appeal with the VA, her team unearthing records of Len's frostbite injuries, the commendation for his actions at Chosen, the Bronze Star that had never been formally presented. "They owe you," Caleb said, reading the latest message, his voice firm with a conviction Len couldn't muster. The idea of back pay, of medical care for his arthritis, stirred a hope Len hadn't dared to nurture, but it also unearthed a fear of being seen, of facing a system that had failed him. He thought of James, his son, somewhere on a ship in the Pacific, and wondered if stability might bring him home. That evening, as the lighthouse's beams swept the darkening sea, Len played his harmonica, the notes a mournful wail for Esther, the melody weaving through the gulls' cries, a song for the son he'd lost to the waves. Caleb stayed late, helping Len repair a shutter loosened by the wind, their hands working in tandem, the boy's strength a counterpoint to Len's frailty. They sat afterward on the shore, the sand cool beneath them, the ocean a vast, breathing presence. "You're not alone anymore," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the dusk, his camera resting on his knee. Len looked at him, the words a lantern in the dark, and felt the stirrings of a bond, a connection forged not by blood but by shared silences. The lighthouse stood above them, its light a steady pulse, a guide through the night, and Len carved a new figure, a tiny boat, for James, leaving it where the tide could find it, a prayer cast to the sea. The wind whispered through the dunes, a promise of change, and Len knew the past was shifting, its weight lighter under the stars, the lantern's vigil now shared, its glow reaching beyond the horizon to touch the man he'd forgotten how to be. The November days grew shorter, the sun dipping below the horizon earlier each evening, casting long shadows across the lighthouse's spiraled tower, its black and white stripes a stark contrast against the bruised purples of the twilight sky. Len moved through his days with the same quiet reverence, the creak of the tower's stairs under his boots a familiar hymn, the scent of oil and salt a constant in the keeper's quarters where he polished the Fresnel lens, its prisms refracting the fading light into shards of color that danced across the walls. The ocean's roar was a steady heartbeat, its waves clawing at the shore with a hunger that mirrored Len's own, a longing for something lost, for the warmth of Esther's touch, for the sound of James's laughter, for the soldier he'd been before Chosen's frost stole pieces of him he'd never reclaimed. Caleb's visits were now a fixture, his jeep's engine a welcome rumble against the wind's howl, his presence a tether to a world Len had long avoided. The young man brought news from Marla, her latest email a beacon of progress. The VA had acknowledged the error in Len's file, his frostbite injuries now recognized as service-connected, with a hearing scheduled in Norfolk to finalize his benefits. "They're talking back pay, Len," Caleb said, his camera slung over his shoulder as he sat on the bench, sketching the lighthouse against the stormy sky. "Maybe even a formal ceremony for your Bronze Star." Len grunted, the idea of a ceremony a bitter pill, but the thought of stability, of a new roof for the trailer, of medical care for his aching joints, softened the edges of his resistance. He carved as they spoke, his knife shaping a tiny gull from driftwood, its wings spread as if to soar, a gift for Caleb, a silent thank you for the light he'd brought into Len's shadowed life. That afternoon, a small group of locals arrived, drawn by Caleb's stories shared at the Nag's Head Diner, fishermen, park rangers, a retired nurse named Doris with a laugh like a foghorn. They came with coffee cans and sandwiches, their voices a chorus against the ocean's drone, asking about the lighthouse, the carvings, Len's time in Korea. At first, Len stayed back, his hands busy with a broom, but Doris's insistence, "Come on, soldier, we don't bite," pulled him into the circle. He spoke haltingly, his voice a low growl, of the war, of the night he'd held his post until his fingers bled, of Esther's peach cobbler that had welcomed him home. The group listened, their faces a mix of awe and sorrow, and Len felt a warmth he hadn't known since Esther's kitchen, a sense of being part of something larger than his solitary vigil. Doris shared her own story. Her father had served in Korea, too, and offered to check Len's arthritis, her hands gentle as she pressed his swollen knuckles, promising a salve from her garden herbs. As the group left, their laughter fading into the wind, Len stood on the shore with Caleb, the tide lapping at their boots, the gull carving in the boy's hands. The lighthouse's beams swept the darkening sea, its light a steady pulse, a guide for the lost, and Len played his harmonica, the notes a soft lament for the years lost, but also a melody of hope, for the community that had found him, for the sun he still dreamed of seeing. The ocean whispered back, its waves a song of endurance, and Len felt the past shift, its weight a foundation now, not a burden, the vigil shared with those who saw him. The first frost of November kissed the dunes, a delicate shimmer of ice tracing the edges of sea oats, their golden stalks bowing under the weight of the cold morning air. Len stood on the tower's balcony, his breath a fleeting cloud against the dawn, his eyes scanning the Atlantic where the waves churned with a restless energy, their crests tipped with foam like the ghosts of forgotten storms. The lighthouse's beam had dimmed with the sunrise, its vigil passed to the day, but Len's own watch felt sharper now, a clarity born of the connections he'd begun to forge. His hands, still stiff with arthritis, clutched a mug of black coffee, the warmth seeping into his palms as he thought of the past few weeks, of Caleb's quiet persistence, of the community that had gathered around him like the gulls above, their wings a promise of companionship. Caleb arrived with the rising sun, his jeep kicking up sand as he parked near the keeper's quarters, a letter from Marla clutched in his hand, his face alight with a grin that cut through the morning chill. "Len, they've scheduled the hearing," he announced, his voice a buoy in the wind, his camera swinging as he paced the gravel path. "Norfolk, next week. Marla says it's a formality. They've approved the back pay, $140,000, and full medical coverage." Len set the mug down, his heart a sudden drumbeat, the numbers a lifeline he hadn't dared to imagine. The money meant a new roof for the trailer, a doctor for his joints, maybe a plane ticket for James if he could be found. Caleb handed him the letter, the paper crisp with promise, and Len read the words, his eyes tracing Marla's assurances. The VA would also present his Bronze Star formally, a ceremony to honor what he'd given. The idea of standing before others, of wearing the medal, stirred a mix of pride and unease, but Caleb's steady gaze anchored him. "You deserve this," the boy said, his words a mirror to Len's buried worth. The news spread through the small community, Doris returning with her herbal salve, its scent of lavender and eucalyptus a comfort as she massaged it into Len's hands, the fishermen and rangers joining them on the shore, their voices a soft chorus against the waves' rhythm, tales of fishing hauls, park trails, and Doris's father, whose stories of Korea echoed Len's own. Len spoke more freely now, his gravelly voice recounting the war's cold, Esther's warmth, the harmonica tune she'd loved. Amazing Grace, which he played for them, the notes a bridge between past and present. The group listened, their silence a reverence, and Len felt the lighthouse's light within him, its beam reaching inward, illuminating the man he'd been, the man he could still be. That evening, as the sky deepened to indigo, the lighthouse's beams swept the sea, its pulse a heartbeat Len could feel in his chest. He carved a new piece, a tiny ship, its sails catching an imagined wind, a gift for James, wherever he sailed. Caleb sat beside him, sketching the scene, his pencil tracing the tower's silhouette against the stars. "We'll find him," Caleb said, his voice a vow, and Len nodded, the harmonica's notes rising into the night, a prayer for reunion. The ocean whispered back, its waves a song of endurance, and Len felt the frost of his past begin to thaw, the lantern's vigil now a shared journey, its light a guide to a future he'd thought lost to the tides. The journey to Norfolk was a pilgrimage through a landscape of memory, the coastal highways stretching past marshes where the reeds swayed like silent sentinels, their tips gilded by a weak winter sun that barely warmed the air inside Caleb's jeep. Len sat in the passenger seat, his coat heavy with the scent of salt and cedar, his hands folded around the tin box that held his Bronze Star, its metal cold against his skin, a relic of the frozen nights when he'd held his post, his squad saved but his soul fractured. The road hummed beneath them, a steady pulse that mirrored the lighthouse's beam, and Len's thoughts drifted to Esther, her voice a melody in his mind, and to James, his son, whose absence was a hollow ache he hoped this trip might heal. Caleb drove with a quiet focus, his camera on the back seat, his voice a soft anchor as he spoke of the hearing, of Marla's assurances, of the community waiting back at Cape Hatteras, their support a net beneath Len's fragile hope. The VA office in Norfolk was a stark contrast to the wild beauty of the coast, its fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the air thick with the scent of paper and bureaucracy. Marla met them at the entrance, her braid tight, her smile a beacon as she led them to a small hearing room where a panel of officials waited, their faces a mix of sternness and curiosity. Len sat stiffly, his hands gripping the box, as Marla presented his case: decades of service, frostbite injuries misclassified, a Bronze Star overlooked, benefits slashed in error. She spoke of his role at the Lighthouse, of Caleb's documentation, of the community that had rallied around him, her voice a steady current that carried Len's story to the panel. The officials listened, their nods slow but deliberate, and when they called Len to speak, his voice was a gravelly hymn, recounting the war, the cold, the men he'd saved, the years he'd survived on the edge of the world. The room fell silent, the weight of his words a tide that shifted the air, and the panel's decision came swiftly: full benefits restored, $140,000 in back pay, medical coverage retroactive to his discharge, and a formal ceremony for his Bronze Star scheduled in Washington, D.C. Len exhaled, the tin box lighter in his hands, the lighthouse's beam a distant pulse he felt in his chest. Back at Cape Hatteras, the news spread like a wave, the community gathering at the lighthouse with lanterns of their own, their glow a constellation against the dusk, a celebration of Len's victory. Doris brought her salve, the fishermen shared stories of the sea, and Caleb captured it all, his camera a witness to the joy that lit Len's weathered face. He played his harmonica, Amazing Grace, rising into the night, the notes a tribute to Esther, a call to James, a psalm of gratitude for the hands that had lifted him. The ocean roared its approval, its waves a chorus, and Len carved a new piece, a tiny lantern, its light a promise, left on the shore for the tide to carry. The lighthouse stood above them, its beams sweeping the darkness, a guide for the lost, and Len felt the past settle, its weight a foundation now, not a burden, the vigil shared with those who saw him. Winter deepened as December arrived, the Atlantic's waves a steel gray under a sky heavy with the promise of snow, their rhythm a heartbeat against the lighthouse's steady vigil. Len moved through his days with a new lightness, the back pay from the VA a lifeline that had transformed his trailer, new shingles on the roof, a heater humming in the corner, a doctor's visit scheduled for his arthritis, the first in years. The Bronze Star, now framed on the wall, gleamed in the lantern light, a symbol of the night when he'd held his post, a past he'd finally begun to embrace. The community's support had grown, the fishermen and rangers a constant presence, Doris's salve a daily comfort, and Caleb's visits a rhythm Len now cherished, the young man's camera and sketches a bridge between the lighthouse and the world beyond. One crisp morning, as frost sparkled on the dunes, a letter arrived, its envelope worn from travel, the handwriting a shock that stopped Len's heart. James, his son, writing from a port in Charleston, South Carolina. "Dad," it began, "I saw the article Caleb wrote about you in a maritime journal. I'm coming home." Len's hands trembled, the paper a lifeline across the years, the words a beacon brighter than the lighthouse's beam. James arrived 2 days later, his merchant marine uniform crisp, his face a mirror of Esther's, same hazel eyes, same quiet smile, his embrace a warmth Len hadn't felt since Esther's arms. "I'm sorry I stayed away," James whispered, his voice breaking, and Len held him tighter, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You're here now," he said, the words a prayer answered, the ocean's roar a witness to their reunion. They sat in the keeper's quarters, the heater's glow a comfort, and James spoke of his years at sea, of the guilt that had kept him away, of the pride he felt reading of Len's resilience. The community welcomed James with open arms, the fishermen sharing tales of the sea, Doris bringing up pie, Caleb capturing the reunion through his lens, his sketches a testament to the bond rekindled. Len showed James the lighthouse, its gears and Len's a legacy of care, and they walked the shore together, the tiny carvings, lighthouses, boats, lanterns, dotting the sand like stars. Len played, Amazing Grace, on his harmonica, the notes a melody for Esther, a song for James, and his son joined in, his voice a baritone that blended with the waves, a harmony of forgiveness. The lighthouse's beams swept the night, its light a promise kept, and Len felt the frost of his past melt fully, the vigil now a shared journey, the lanterns glow a homecoming under the winter stars. By early January 2026, Cape Hatteras shimmered under a rare snowfall, the dunes blanketed in white, the lighthouse a sentinel in a world softened by winter's touch, its beam cutting through the flurries with a steady pulse that echoed Len's renewed heart. The trailer, now a home, hummed with life. James had stayed, taking leave from the merchant marine to rebuild his bond with Len, their days filled with repairs, laughter, and the quiet rhythm of the lighthouse's care. The VA benefits had brought stability, medical care easing Len's arthritis, a new harmonica replacing the cracked one, its notes brighter as he played for Esther, for James, for the community that had become family. The bronze star on the wall was now a point of pride, a story Len shared freely with the fishermen, rangers, and Doris, whose herbal salve remained a constant in his life. Caleb's project had grown, his thesis on coastal erosion now a book, Beacons of Resilience, with a chapter on Len, the lighthouse, and the community that had rallied around him. The book's release brought visitors, veterans, historians, locals, who walked the shore, collecting Len's carvings, their voices a chorus of gratitude as they shared their own stories of war and survival. James helped Len start a workshop, teaching kids to carve driftwood, the keepers' quarters alive with their chatter, their tiny lighthouses a legacy for the future. One evening, as snow fell softly, Caleb organized a lantern vigil at the lighthouse, the community gathering with candles and stories, their light a constellation against the night, a tribute to Len's journey. Len spoke, his voice steady, thanking them, his harmonicas, Amazing Grace, rising into the sky, the notes a hymn for Esther, a song for James, a melody for the life he'd reclaimed. Under the stars, Len stood with James and Caleb, the ocean's whisper a gentle lullaby, the lighthouse's beam a guide that had led him home. He held a new carving, a tiny family of 3, for Esther, James, and himself, placing it on the shore, the tide a gentle hand to carry it forward. The lantern's vigil had become a shared light, its glow a testament to a veteran who'd found his way, the whispers of the pines now a song of belonging, echoing through the winter night.